This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 60 of the Photographing the West podcast, sponsored by Flanagan Photos. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan. Welcome back to all our listeners. Today we have a very special guest, Tim Gray, photographer, educator, and Lightroom and Photoshop guru. Welcome to Photographing the West, Tim.
Thanks very much, Kirby. I'm glad to be here.
And I'm very glad you are here. So, tell everybody about yourself as a person, a photographer, and an educator.
That's sort of a funny one, actually. Funny question, because I kind of feel like they're all wrapped up into one. You know, who I am and who I am as a person, as a photographer, as an educator. It's all sort of all one big bundle, I suppose. It's sort of a funny thing. A quick little story. At least I'll try to make it quick. I, at one point, way back in high school, was told that I had switched schools and I was actually at risk of not being eligible to graduate from high school, as it turned out, because I didn't have enough electives, which I thought was a little bit silly in the first place. But then I realized this was a fabulous opportunity. I got to pick any fun classes, as many fun classes as I wanted to sign up for. And so I went through the list of the electives that were offered, and I signed up for photography, I signed up for journalism, and I signed up to be a teacher's assistant. Now, it took me a while. About 10 years later, I realized that that was a moment where I had the opportunity to choose essentially to do anything I wanted. And I chose photography, writing, and teaching, which is the foundation of everything that I've been doing essentially for the last, I don't know how long it's been, 20 plus years that I've been focused on teaching photography. So as a person, I love teaching. I love photography, I love traveling, and I'm very fortunate that I've been able to sort of bundle all of that together into, I suppose you could call it a career. To me, it's sort of more a mishmash of all sorts of different things that I do, but they all have this common theme of taking pictures, traveling around. Most of my photography now is sort of focused on travel, in large part because I just travel a ton, and so when I'm photographing, I'm usually also traveling. So it's not necessarily travel photography per se, but it's me taking pictures while I'm traveling somewhere else more often than not. And, I started realizing that that really is a focus of everything that I'm doing, traveling, taking pictures, and then sharing with others how to do all of those things, hopefully in the best way possible in terms of taking better pictures, organizing their photos a little bit better, and optimizing their photos to look the best, and all the other fun things that go along with photography.
Well, you certainly have a lot of that going on, no question about that. You got to be a very busy guy, I would think.
Very true, yes. I do travel quite a lot, speaking at events and teaching workshops, and so it tends to be one of sort of two things. Either I'm off traveling somewhere, and of course I'm busy getting from place to place and teaching and speaking and photographing, or I'm back home in New York City, and then it's a different kind of busy where now I'm trying to catch up on all the things that slipped behind while I was traveling. But I do keep very busy. Many photographers know me first and foremost as the publisher of the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. And this is an email that goes out every weekday and has been for a little more than 17 years now. And a question and answer format. And, originally when I started this email newsletter, I thought it was just going to be a short-term thing until I answered all the questions that I would receive, neglecting to realize that those questions were never going to stop, and they continue to this day. So that certainly keeps me busy, and writing articles and whatnot, producing video training content. Back in the day, early on in my career, I started out writing books focused on photography and Photoshop and then Lightroom. And over time, that just sort of evolved into, instead of teaching by virtue of the written word in a book, most of my teaching now is by virtue of video training. So recording videos, either where I'm out in the field talking about photography techniques, or I'm helping you with software, so Lightroom, Photoshop, and a variety of other software tools to help you in your workflow. So that is a big focus. And so when I'm traveling, we're usually making videos out in the field. When I'm at home, I'm usually making videos in the studio. So I do manage to stay extremely busy for sure.
Right. Well, speaking of Lightroom and Photoshop, why don't you update everybody on what the most recent important changes to those programs are, if you can do
Yeah,
that.
it sure. No, of course. Yeah, it's an interesting consideration. Photoshop is one of the software tools that I've been working with and teaching the longest. It's getting right around 25 years since the first release of Photoshop. And so one of the things I would say in the context of photography is it's a very mature application. And so it's gotten to the point where there's not as much going on in the way of updates that affect photographers within Photoshop. Not too terribly long ago, we had the addition of that content-aware technology for the image cleanup tool. More recently, there's now a content-aware workspace, which gives you a little bit more flexibility with that image cleanup. But many of the updates to Photoshop recently have either been, I would say, a little bit more superficial or focused more on tools beyond photography. So, for example, Photoshop is now capable of doing quite a bit in the way of video editing, both in terms of changing the appearance of the video and then re-rendering it, and a variety of other tasks. Obviously, as many can appreciate, I'm sure, Photoshop is there really serving a lot of different types of creative professionals, with photography just being one of those. And so there's not been a huge number of updates to Photoshop proper. One thing I will say, though, is that Camera Raw, which originally was just sort of a plug-in for Photoshop and now is a little bit more integrated directly into Photoshop, that has been changing somewhat dramatically, which really kind of reflects the changes in Lightroom, because Camera Raw for processing raw captures in Photoshop and the Lightroom Develop module actually share the same engine. They are the exact same software essentially behind the scenes. And so as Lightroom is updated, so too is Camera Raw. So it's gotten to the point where just because we can do so much in Lightroom, that extends over to Photoshop in the context of Camera Raw, where you can get the vast majority of your editing done just in that raw processing with Camera Raw if you're a Photoshop user as opposed to a Lightroom user. And really that means also that for many photographers who are using Lightroom, the Develop module gives you essentially the vast majority of everything you need, where Photoshop is becoming a little bit less critical in terms of a part of the workflow for a photographer. And so a lot more of the emphasis lately has been on Lightroom. And when I say Lightroom in general, I'm referring to Lightroom Classic CC. We can talk more about those differences shortly, but in terms of Lightroom, to me, one of the biggest changes relatively recently, not super recently, but relatively recently, was the ability to process HDR or high dynamic range images as well as panoramas right inside of Lightroom. I think that's kind of a big deal, and it really is a very good set of tools as well. They produce very good results, even compared to some of the other top software that are out there. But for me, a couple of things that are really significant somewhat recently is the ability to identify folders as both favorites and with a color label. And so we're able to extend the organizational tools that we might use with our photos. So assigning star ratings to identify your best versus maybe not so good versus your outtake photos. Now we can also identify favorite folders, and we can assign color labels to folders. And so, for example, I'll use a color label assigned to a folder in Lightroom to identify folders that I still need to finish reviewing photos in. So during a trip, when I've not yet necessarily gone through all the photos that I've captured, I can mark a folder with a red color label so it stands out. I can also mark favorite folders so that the folders I'm tending to work with a lot, and those tend to be, relatively recent trips that were especially significant for me, I can mark those folders as favorites. And as part of that, we can filter those folders as well. So I can filter folders based on having a color label or having that favorite status, which I think is a tremendous benefit in the workflow, especially if you're using, like I am, folders as a really key component of your base level, your overall organizational system. You can get to have a lot of folders in your Lightroom catalog. So being able to filter them a little more effectively, I think, is great. And there's also a new feature that it's interesting. It's not, I would say, something that's necessarily going to make a huge difference in anyone's workflow immediately. But most recently, there's been an update, a new feature called Enhanced Details, which actually takes a raw capture within Lightroom Classic and processes it, converts it into an Adobe DNG, a digital negative file format, and promises to enhance the overall details in the image to improve texture and reduce noise, etc. And it's interesting that from a concept standpoint, theoretically, it's really interesting. My testing so far has shown that it's not making a dramatic difference with most images. And so I feel that it's a feature that shows promise that isn't something that I necessarily need in my workflow today. But I like that Adobe is thinking about these things in terms of how can we leverage what they have in terms of incredible knowledge in the world of digital imaging and find ways to take our photos to dramatic new heights, to being able to potentially enlarge them much more significantly than we were able to in the past, or to extract better detail out of those images, those sorts of things. So it's something I want to keep an eye on. I'm curious to see how much further they're able to develop that to create potentially significant improvements for photos. But that's one that's maybe not quite a super significant. You don't need to run out and start applying that on every one of your photos right now, but it might be fun to play around with for many photographers at the very least.
Yeah, that does sound interesting, actually. I should have stated the question is not that you can do it, but can you do it in less than an hour, I guess.
That's a good point. Well, and it's one of the interesting things. A lot of photographers got frustrated when Adobe switched to this subscription model, where to use Photoshop and Lightroom, you need to pay a subscription each month. And I have to admit that while I too was a little skeptical of that approach, I am seeing a lot more frequent updates to the Adobe applications, which I think is great. It shows that they are committed to essentially trying to demonstrate the value of that subscription. So I hope they'll continue thinking creatively about what other features they can continue adding. Obviously, in the world of digital photography, many of these tools have gotten to the point where I don't think there's anything necessarily missing in terms of optimizing photos, but things that can help streamline our workflows, help us get better organized, I think would be good directions to start taking some of these tools.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Talking about new tools, one that intrigues me, and I have to say I'm not sure when and where to use it, is masking by depth map.
Right.
Can you talk about that a bit?
Certainly, yeah. So there's been a variety of interesting developments, technologically. Some people might be familiar, some photographers might be aware of the Lightroom cameras that were out for a little while. There's been these technologies of planoptic lenses, and essentially lenses that are able to not only capture pixel information, but also capture depth. In other words, how far away from the lens was a given subject. So with the Lightroom cameras, for example, because of all this additional information that the camera was gathering at the time you took the picture, you could adjust focus and depth of field after the fact. It never really got too far, but it was interesting technology. And so I'm sure many photographers now are familiar with some of the latest models of iPhone include a portrait mode. And they're essentially, the phones that support this portrait mode are capturing a depth map. So they are, for all intents and purposes, measuring the distances from the subject for whatever it is that you're photographing. And so, for example, if you had a model in the foreground with the landscape off in the background, you could know the difference in terms of the distance between the model in the foreground of the portrait and the landscape in the background. And so Lightroom now supports this depth map feature. So there's a range masking feature that's available for the targeted adjustments in Lightroom. So those would be the graduated filter, the radial filter, and the adjustment brush. And so, for example, you could apply a graduated adjustment where you're adjusting the sky up at the top of the image and then gradually tapering off in a gradient fashion toward the bottom. So the bottom of the image is not getting affected and the top is being affected. But now with this depth map, if we have an image that supports it, that includes that depth map information, we can actually use that information to focus the adjustment, for example, only on the background, not the subject in the foreground, or only on the subject in the foreground and not the background. Right now, you need to have an image that was captured with that capability. So for the moment, that would be the HEIF captures from portrait mode with the iPhone. And if you've got that, then when you're editing such a photo in Lightroom, from the range mask pop-up for those targeted adjustments, you can choose the depth option, and it gives you can actually display the depth map it's sort of a low resolution shades of gray, giving you these gradations that give you a sense of distance from the lens so that you can identify foreground versus background and choose where you want to place that focus in terms of the distance. And so admittedly, if you've played around with portrait mode on the iPhone, initially it looks absolutely amazing. You're taking a smartphone with this tiny little lens and this tiny little sensor, and a scenario where, because of that small sensor, you typically have tremendous depth of field, which is not always a good thing. We want to be able to get narrow depth of field. Well, the portrait mode gives you that ability by blurring the background. The problem is that in many cases, the mask for that blurring is not the most accurate. So if it is a portrait of a model with, some hair wisping in the breeze, you're going to see some visual artifacts. So it's not perfect, but it does show us some of the potential of future technology. So it's an interesting thing to play with right now. It shows tremendous promise, and I really hope that we're able to get essentially a depth map with higher resolution so that we can really take this to the limit, very similar to what Lightroom was offering with their specialty cameras and the software for post-processing, to be able to adjust your focus point, potentially adjust your depth of field in the case of Lightroom, and then also using that depth information, the distance information, to be able to target adjustments to specific regions of the photo. I think that holds tremendous promise in terms of being able to really optimize some of our photos in post-processing.
So right now there aren't any DSLRs or mirrorless cameras that'll record that information? Is that
right? Exactly. To my knowledge, there's not. I'm sure at some point soon there will be at least a mirrorless camera, compact camera that'll come up with that. But right now, the depth map is not supported by any other cameras that I'm aware of.
Is that something that could be added by an update, or does it take a new camera?
Well, it would take a new camera, at least as far as the cameras that are out there right now, because of the need to have multiple lenses to capture this additional information. And so it would be a little bit tricky to try and reverse engineer into a current camera. I'm sure somebody could figure out a way to do that. But yeah, it would take some different lenses, some different capabilities in the cameras, or somebody clever who finds another solution altogether. But I think a lot of this comes down to individual implementations of technology that, if they catch on and if they gain the attention of enough photographers, we're likely to see those broadening out. There's many technologies, of course, that never really make it very far, for better or for worse. But this one, I think it's an interesting one. Lightroom cameras, the technology behind it was really incredible. But the cameras themselves were frankly not all that good. They were a little difficult to use, low resolution, and there just didn't feel to be a very strong use case for being able to change the focus is one thing. So adjusting the specific focal point, because you were starting with a photo where essentially everything was in focus, but then you could choose how much depth of field you wanted and where exactly you want to position the focus in terms of distance. That holds some promise, but it was never really implemented in a way that photographers could leverage it the way we really would want to with a high resolution photo. It was mostly focused on this, sort of clever online sharing where people could change the focus after the fact when they're viewing the image. And I think that's just not as interesting as the photographer really being able to make those adjustments directly. And in order for that to be useful, you need to have high resolution images. You have to have a good quality depth map. And there just so far hasn't been one solution that puts all of those pieces together. But, to me, I find it really interesting. I know a lot of photographers have talked about it not being, that great and that they want to control it at the time of capture. And that's all well and good. But those same photographers are capturing in RAW rather than JPEG so that they've got a little more flexibility in post. I don't want to depend upon the ability to adjust depth of field, for example, after the capture or apply these targeted adjustments. But I sure like having that flexibility. And photography, part of the reason that it's intriguing to me personally is that it's an art form that involves technology. And, the technologies tend to be dismissed a little bit or made fun of early on, and then they become critical. Autofocus was seen as almost a cheat, that why would you use autofocus? You should only be focusing manually. Auto exposure, same sort of thing. You should be shooting in manual mode. And I see these bits of technology as tools that can make us better photographers and help us focus on the creative so we don't have to spend so much time focusing on the technology behind it. And so I think any of these things that might give us an advantage, might give us some creative potential, I think are wonderful, and I'd love to see them develop further.
Yeah, I think that makes great sense. And photographers in general are fairly conservative a lot, I guess you'd have to say.
Right.
When it comes to technology.
Well, I remember back in the day, when things were transitioning from film to digital, how many photographers swore they would never shoot digital. They were going to be film forever. And then especially when digital started surpassing the resolution of film, they changed their tune a little bit. So, we have to be careful when we criticize technology, because when it's in its infancy, it might not seem to have as much potential, but as things develop, it can start to get more and more interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk about the multiple versions of Lightroom. Which ones work best for which photographers? I noticed you mentioned the CC Classic, which is what I use.
Right.
But there's lots of other variations, and I'd have to say I don't really use them, but I'm sure they work for somebody. So can you cover that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a question that I think a lot of photographers are sort of grappling with. It's an area that I think has confused a lot of photographers. So we had, Lightroom has been around for a while now. And then not too long ago, Lightroom CC, which is the Lightroom that we've always known about, it was Lightroom 6, and then they transitioned into a naming of Lightroom CC. And then they transitioned to having a new version of Lightroom called Lightroom CC, and the previous version that was called Lightroom CC then becomes Lightroom Classic CC. So understandably, that caused some confusion among photographers, not just in what do I call this software, but which one's right for me. And of course, I think one of the mistakes maybe some photographers might have made is assuming that the new one is the one they should be transitioning to without looking at whether or not it was necessarily the right solution for them. So in a nutshell, the way I think of this is Lightroom Classic CC is designed for photographers who want to manage their photos with local storage, meaning you want to store your photos on hard drives in your studio or in your office or wherever it is that you're doing your work. Lightroom CC is the cloud-based, the newer version of Lightroom, and that involves synchronization of all of your photos to the cloud, in other words, to internet-based storage. And so you can still have copies of your photos stored locally, but the primary storage is now on Adobe's servers. The primary advantage of that cloud-based approach is that now all of your photos, every single photo, is available everywhere from virtually any device. And so I can take my entire library of photos and it's on my laptop, and then I can have it on my iPad, and I can have it on my iPhone. I can go to an internet cafe and use somebody else's computer, and I can log in to lightroom.adobe.com and see all of my photos there. And that's kind of cool and clever. For me, part of the problem with that, though, is I have way too many photos, and I don't always have access to a fast internet connection, especially when I'm traveling. And so I don't really feel, with my 400,000 plus photos in my Lightroom catalog, Lightroom Classic catalog, I certainly don't need most of those to go to the cloud, because many of them are frankly not that great. I've got, my favorite photos and my outtakes. And my personal approach, which is largely a philosophical thing, is that I don't want to delete all my outtakes. I want to keep them around just in case. It makes me feel more comfortable. And so to me, Lightroom CC, cloud-based, is not the right solution. That said, for photographers who just want all of their photos available everywhere, it is obviously a solution that will give you that. So I would say that for most photographers who are commercial photographers, who are passionate amateur photographers, hobbyists, that probably Lightroom Classic CC is the better solution. That said, there are certainly photographers for whom Lightroom CC, the cloud-based version, makes sense. So, if you want to have your photos available everywhere, no matter what device you're on, then I would take a look at Lightroom CC. If you are more comfortable, like I am, having those photos stored locally on hard drives that you're controlling, then I would look at Lightroom Classic, keeping in mind that with Lightroom Classic CC, we can create collections of images. These are essentially subsets of your photos. You can create a collection, add whichever photos you want to a given collection, and you can enable synchronization for just that collection. And so we have this variation on a theme essentially where with Lightroom Classic, I can pick and choose which photos I want to have synchronized. In other words, which photos I want available from anywhere. So for example, I share my photos somewhat frequently on Instagram. And so the photos I share to Instagram, I put into a collection, I synchronize that collection. So now on any device, even on a computer that I borrow from someone else and sign into lightroom.adobe.com, I can browse all of those photos virtually instantly. And so to me, Lightroom Classic gives you the best of both worlds in that you have a little more control over the workflow, and you also still have that ability to synchronize just the photos that you actually want to have sort of available anywhere.
Assuming you have an internet connection, let alone a quick one.
Also true.
So what's the role of Lightroom Mobile?
Well, Lightroom Mobile.
Understood that one.
Yeah, Lightroom Mobile is interesting as well. It really is providing many of the features of Lightroom on a mobile device. And so there's versions for both iOS, so an iPhone or an iPad, as well as Android. And so if you are using Lightroom CC, then all of the photos that you import into your catalog will sort of magically appear on your phone once it's able to synchronize, again, with that high-speed internet connection. But the interesting thing about Lightroom Mobile, which has been renamed essentially to Lightroom CC, which might lead you to believe it only is designed to work with Lightroom CC, the cloud-based version, that's actually not the case. Lightroom, the app for mobile devices, can synchronize with either. So if you're using Lightroom Classic CC and synchronizing just certain collections, those can appear on your mobile device. Or if you are using Lightroom CC, the full cloud-based version, then you can actually browse all of your photos on your mobile device. In addition to that, though, you can have photos that you capture. If you use the Lightroom app on your mobile device to capture photos, you can have those photos automatically synchronized to your other installations of Lightroom as well, depending on which one you're using. And so to me, it's mostly about having Lightroom available to you on the go. I don't tend to use it all that often. For me personally, I don't like using a smaller device. I like using a laptop with a keyboard and a mouse. I like using keyboard shortcuts and all that good stuff. And so I prefer the utility of a computer, but many photographers are comfortable using a mobile device. And so, for example, at the very least, you might consider synchronizing a collection of photos that you need to review to Lightroom Mobile so that you can actually, for example, on your flight home from a trip, you could be using an iPad, a tablet, or a smartphone to review and assign star ratings to your photos, for example, that'll synchronize back to either Lightroom Classic or Lightroom CC, depending on which version you're using. So there is some utility there. I think really, though, it's more about mindset of, are you a photographer that tends to use your mobile device for just about everything, and you also want to be able to work with your photos in terms of applying adjustments, adding keywords, assigning star ratings, etc.? Or do you just want to use it for sharing your photos, just having collections of photos available? And so it's an app that has a lot of utility, and I think different photographers will use it in different ways. For me personally, it's mostly just about making it easier to share some of my photos. For other photographers, they're perfectly comfortable applying adjustments using a mobile device when they're on the go, for example.
Well, let's move on to discuss all the multiple plugins that are available for Lightroom and Photoshop. Now, which ones do you recommend and why, and what's their use case?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, especially as Photoshop and Lightroom have gotten to become more powerful, that plugins have, sort of diminished in utility by virtue of many of the features that used to be available only in plugins might now be available in Lightroom or Photoshop. So for example, one example would be assembling high dynamic range or HDR images. That used to require third-party software. Now you can do that directly in Photoshop or within Lightroom. And so to me, the use case for plugins is twofold. If a plugin gives you some sort of creative benefit, or if it gives you a workflow benefit. And so one plugin that I actually make use of is Aurora HDR from Skyloom software. As I mentioned earlier, Lightroom Classic actually does a pretty good job of assembling HDR images, but in many cases I've found that I'm not able to assemble an HDR image, the bracketed exposures in Lightroom. It'll fail to assemble, or it will assemble in a way that doesn't look very good, where we've got some problems with ghosting and whatnot. And so while it generally does a great job, every now and then I find a set of images that it doesn't do a very good job with. And I found consistently when I run into that, if I send the photos over to Aurora, I get a good result. And so for me, Aurora is a little bit more of a workflow benefit, but it also has some really interesting tools for being able to work with the images. It goes, in some respects, a little beyond what Lightroom has, especially when you want to extract detail out of an image. In Lightroom, we have, for example, clarity adjustment and dehaze. With Aurora HDR, we've got a variety of additional tools for really getting into the nitty-gritty of some of the detail in your photos. And so I do find that to be useful. Another tool that I really like, it's been around for a long time. Many photographers, I'm sure, are familiar with the Nik collection. And there's a number of plugins there. It's now being offered by DxO. So it had been a standalone company a long time ago, and then Google acquired them, and now DxO more recently has acquired them. And some of the tools in this collection, admittedly, have not been updated in a long time, and so are not especially useful. But a couple that I really like in that collection are Silver Effects Pro for creating black and white images, and Analog Effects Pro, which kind of takes that to a more extreme variation, being able to produce all sorts of old film, wet plate and classic film styles, etc., all sorts of creative effects in that regard. And so I do find those to be fun. But there are a variety of different plugins out there, and so I would certainly say that in many cases the plugin might not do something that you couldn't have done within Lightroom or Photoshop, for example. But sometimes they give you a little more creative inspiration. They might give you a workflow benefit, or you might just like the way the software is organized a little bit better. And the great thing about most of these tools is that they're generally available as a free trial. And so you can download a trial that'll work for, a week, 2 weeks, 30 days, depending on the plugin. And it gives you a chance to really test it out with your own images. So if any of them sound at all interesting, I would certainly encourage you to check out that trial version, play around and see if it might be a tool that would work in your workflow to help you improve your images.
What's the learning curve on Aurora HDR?
Well, in terms of the basics of assembling, it's actually pretty straightforward. What you're doing, as many photographers I'm sure are familiar with HDR, you're taking a set of bracketed exposures, merging all of that information into a single HDR image. And Aurora does a very good job, I think, of stepping you through that process, the various options that are available as part of that process. And then once the HDR image is created, the second step is tone mapping, taking that huge range of tonal values that were represented by your bracketed exposures and mapping them down to the range of a typical photographic image, interpreting how you're translating that information. And there certainly are a lot of options available in Aurora HDR, and that can be a bit intimidating. But fortunately, the basis of Aurora is a set of presets that come installed by default, and you can then, of course, create your own. And each of those is represented as a thumbnail of your actual image. So it's not just some abstract thumbnail that gives you a theoretical idea of what that plugin might do. It actually takes your image that you're currently working on, and you'll see a set of thumbnails for each of the presets that are available there. And you can use that as a starting point, or you could just, if you find a preset that you like, you just click on it and you're finished. And then you can gradually get to know all of the various tools. So the presets store the adjustments that are available, the wide variety of adjustments that are available in Aurora HDR. And so in many cases, you might find that preset is all you need, but also by paying attention to what changes among the settings when you're looking at those different presets, you can get an idea of which adjustments you might want to play around with on the right-hand side of the interface in Aurora HDR. So I'd say getting the basics up and running is pretty straightforward in Aurora HDR. Getting to know all of the many adjustments there, that's certainly a little bit more involved.
Well, speaking of HDR, I'm wondering whether the increased dynamic range of current cameras, do you still need HDR software, or does that dynamic range solve that problem for you?
Slowly but surely we're getting there. So I would say there's certainly now fewer situations where you need HDR, but it's certainly not obsolete by any stretch. So we've gotten cameras now that have expanded in terms of the dynamic range available, and it's very impressive. But when you have something like, the sun in the frame, for example, then you're definitely going to need to have HDR, because you're just never going to be able to, well, not never, but right now you're not going to be able to capture that full range in a single image. And so there are still a variety of situations, many situations where we need HDR when we've got very strong lighting in one area of the scene and then dark shadows in another. And we just want to make sure that we can maximize. And it's twofold. Number one is maximizing the amount of detail we present in the image. And number two is minimizing the noise. So even with a higher dynamic range image, if you're just barely able to cover the range, the tonal range in a scene with a more advanced camera today, you're still going to have a lot of information that falls in those dark shadow areas. And if you try to brighten up those dark shadows, you're going to end up with significant noise potentially, depending on how dark and what the original settings were. With HDR, we're able to minimize that because we can capture essentially better information in those dark shadows. And so it gives us greater flexibility in terms of image quality. So even in situations where it might be borderline, I'll sometimes bracket anyway to try to make sure that I'm getting as good a quality information for the photo where I don't have to open up those shadows quite so much. So certainly cameras are getting better, and we're able to, you might say, sort of get away with not bracketing for HDR in an increasing number of situations, but it definitely is not an obsolete feature just yet. Hopefully, I would love to no longer need to bracket exposures for HDR to have this tremendous dynamic range in any camera without sacrificing other things, such as noise. And we're making progress, and hopefully that'll just continue as technology gets more and more advanced.
So switching gears a little bit, what are your thoughts about standalone software like ON1 and some of the others out there?
Yeah, there's a variety of these software tools, many of which, including ON1, sort of started off focusing on that plugin market that we were talking about earlier, being plugins for Photoshop or Lightroom. But now they're starting to shift toward being more standalone, where they could be your solo solution, the only software you need. So theoretically, at this point, you could certainly have a workflow that revolves around ON1 software rather than Lightroom or Photoshop, for example. And, it's tricky because on the one hand, I love that there is this competition. I want there to be lots of third-party developers that are sort of nipping at the heels of Adobe, helping to keep Adobe on their toes. I want them to feel that competition a little bit. At the same time, I am, a little bit hesitant of adopting software as a key element of my workflow if I'm not confident they're going to be around in the long term. Of course, how do you even figure out whether or not a software company is going to be around for the long term, or if a particular product will be around for the long term? When Apple released Aperture, I don't think there was any doubts about the future of that company, and yet that software didn't last all that long, and many photographers struggled with trying to transition from a workflow that revolved around Aperture to something else. And so that's something that I try to keep in mind with my own workflow, choosing software where I think I have the best chance of that company and their tools, their software being around in the long term, but also defining a workflow where I'm not too dependent upon that software. And so, for example, in Lightroom, making sure, trying to avoid the use of features that are Lightroom specific. So pick and reject flags in Lightroom, for example, are not part of standard metadata. And so even if you save your metadata out to your actual image files in Lightroom, you're not actually going to be preserving the pick and reject flags. Those only exist in your Lightroom catalog. And so if you lose your Lightroom catalog, you've lost your pick and reject flags. And that obviously could be frustrating, could be a challenge. And so I try to define a workflow that involves software that I hope I can count on in the long term, and trying to make sure that I'm retaining control of my images and control of my metadata. And I have to say that ON1, I think, does a great job. It is software that produces great results. They've got a good workflow. And so any photographer that's using ON1 or thinking about it, I wouldn't try to talk them out of it by any stretch. So I think they're a good example of a company that's doing great work, and I think has the potential to remain successful because of that good work that they're doing. But it's always something that I'm a little bit cautious about. As you mentioned, photographers, I think myself included, tend to be a little conservative, a little cautious about, what they're going to adopt in their workflow. And so, Adobe, for better or for worse, has become very dominant in the imaging space as far as software. That's, potentially both good and bad. It means that they're in a strong position. It also means that there might not be as much incentive on their part to improve their products if they have, a dominant position in the industry. So I think the way things are right now, there's the potential for these smaller companies, these third-party developers, to win some market share and maybe scare Adobe a little bit to make sure that they continue developing great software. But I'd love to see these third-party companies succeed on their own as well.
Yeah, you only have to look back at Kodak to see what can happen to a dominant company.
Exactly. Yeah, if they miss one cue, they think things are going one way and they end up going in another direction, or they don't take it as seriously as they should, for example. None of this is set in stone, certainly.
Some of these standalone companies are starting to use AI as part of their processing. What do you see as the future for AI in photo software, and how will it affect our workflow?
Well, potentially it could have a huge impact on our workflow. And this is another area where, the technology, as much as AI has been around for a while, it's still a little bit in its infancy in terms of the results it's able to achieve. And there are, some key examples, I think. One is processing of images in terms of the actual adjustments. And this is one that I think a lot of photographers like to criticize a little bit, in that I don't want my computer trying to decide how to adjust my photos. And yet the computer is sort of already deciding how to adjust the photos. When we're talking about a raw capture, we're not really talking about pixels per se. So the information in that raw capture needs to be translated. And so that's the job of the raw processing engine of Adobe Camera Raw with Photoshop, or the Develop module in Lightroom. And those software tools have sort of this default interpretation. What you see initially in these other software tools is not the same as what you see on the back of the camera, because the camera and these other software tools are interpreting the raw data differently. And so AI technology has the potential to apply automatic adjustments that might give us a better starting point for our images. I'm sure many photographers have used some auto adjustments, or at least experimented with them, and been disappointed with the results, because, automatic adjustment, as you can imagine, it's often not going to be tailored to that specific image, and it certainly doesn't know what the photographer's intent was. But I would say in that context, there is the potential AI to process, to analyze what other photographers have done with their images. So conceptually, for example, Adobe could look at all of the data of how do photographers use clarity and how do they use vibrance, just to pick a couple of common adjustments. And if photographers on average tend to increase clarity up to, a level of 50 and increase vibrance up to 30, maybe those should become sort of new defaults. Obviously, it varies from one image to the next, but that's just one example of how we can analyze data and apply some adjustments as part of that process, but then analyzing the image. And this is where things really start to get interesting potentially. So if AI can analyze your image so that it can apply better adjustments based on what kind of image this is, now also it can analyze the subject matter. So think automatic keywording, for example, being able to search. And this already exists in a couple of software tools. The cloud-based version of Lightroom, Lightroom CC, has this ability based on image analysis. You could search for Statue of Liberty, and you'll find pictures of the Statue of Liberty. You'll find a few false positives. You might find the Statue of Liberty at the New York Hotel in Las Vegas included in the mix. You might find pictures that aren't the Statue of Liberty at all but got mistaken for it. So it's certainly not perfect now. It might not ever be perfect, but there is some potential to help streamline our workflow. And if it's done intelligently, I think it can be just absolutely wonderful, both in terms of, image analysis to give us some better starting points for our adjustments, to assign keywords essentially automatically, and even just filtering. In Photoshop Elements, for example, the organizer there can mark photos that it thinks are out of focus, that thinks are blurry, and, a variety of other things. So there's some of these capabilities that could potentially help streamline our workflow in a variety of ways. And Adobe has made big bets on artificial intelligence with their Adobe Sensei technology. Other companies certainly have done similar things, looking at the analysis, Google image searches, some of the things that we're able to get from this analysis of tremendous amounts of data, which is sort of what AI is all about. The potential there is just incredible, and I certainly think that we will see, as the technology improves, we'll see some real great benefits for our workflows thanks to AI.
anything that would reduce the need for keywording would certainly be a boon as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. And we're getting there. Obviously, there's a trust factor in terms of the accuracy, but I've had more than one software developer tell me in the context of photo imaging that at some point keywording, we'll just look back and laugh. What do you mean you used to type keywords for your images when there's so much that can be gained just from image analysis? Most of my photos have GPS coordinates built into the metadata because my camera has a GPS receiver. And assuming that I remembered to set the time properly, changing time zones or what have you, there's also the timestamp on the photos. And so, for example, that information could be analyzed, and this isn't even really AI per se, but that information could be analyzed so I could say, show me pictures that were captured during golden hour, and based on the time the photo was captured and the geographic coordinates, the GPS coordinates, the software could figure out which photos were captured at a time that for the location was during golden hour, an hour before sunset, let's say. And so, taking that further and actually analyzing the photo, face recognition and object recognition, there's already a lot of work that's been done by many companies in this area. And as it continues getting better and better, it's going to affect many aspects of our lives in general, but I think it will also help to improve our photographic workflow.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool, actually. Let's spend a few minutes talking about the Gray Learning Center. That's one of your teaching tools. Who's
Right.
that for, and what topics does it cover?
Yeah, so Gray Learning is my library of educational content, primarily video training. As I mentioned, I started off a long time ago writing books, and at some point started transitioning into video training. In large part, I've always felt that for photographers, the best way to learn is in person. If you can take a hands-on workshop, then that's perhaps your best avenue. And, so for example, I lead photo workshops at a variety of locations around the world where, we'll spend typically 5 days with a small group of photographers where I'm taking them around locations that I know very well and helping them get better pictures. Well, that's a great way to learn, but it also is limited to a relatively small number of photographers. And I found over the years, reading is great. Many photographers want to buy a book and kind of bury their nose into the book and learn that way. But I find that the closer thing to actually hands-on learning is video training, where I can talk to you about what I'm doing and I can actually show you what I'm doing as part of that process. And so we put considerable effort into producing video training courses on photography, on Lightroom, on Photoshop, and a variety of other software tools. And we've gotten now over 100 hours of educational lessons on a wide variety of subjects. There's a lot of content in that library, and I'm literally adding new content each and every week. We have some courses, for example, that provide a new tip about photo gear, that show you the story behind one of my photographs, that give you a tip on Photoshop or a tip on Lightroom, and each of those gets a new lesson each and every week. And then we add additional courses over time as well. In fact, I'm working on one now that is focused on helping you plan for photos with the sun in particular and potentially the moon. And so, some interesting possibilities there. And so it's really aimed at any photographer who's passionate about photography and wants some help in optimizing their overall photography and their workflow. And so whether it's taking pictures in the first place, getting those photos organized, or optimizing them after the fact. I mean, I will say that it's the organizational part that I find most photographers are really focused on. My best-selling course is called Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom, to help those photographers who have gotten a bit of clutter in their Lightroom catalog. But more recently, we've been focusing on a lot more photography-related subjects as well, which for me, it's great fun. As I mentioned right from the start, I love teaching. I love photography. And so this is a really great outlet for me to create content that I hope will help many, many photographers improve their overall photography and workflow.
Are you able to do those videos on your own, or do you have a team that works with you?
Well, primarily, it depends on the nature of the videos, but most of those I'm doing on my own or with a very small team of me and my wife. So we are a small team, but a scrappy team.
Okay. Well, before we go, tell everybody where they can find you and all the things you do and all the resources you provide.
Well, as we've sort of hinted at, I guess, I am all over the place doing a lot of work related to helping photographers make the most of their workflow. So the Gray Learning website, which is graylearning.com, I mentioned the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. I'm on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. So if you're a social media person, you can find me there under Tim Gray Photo. But the one-stop shop, I would say the best place to go get a sense of what I'm doing, about the photo workshops I lead, and just about me in general, is timgrayphoto.com. So that's the best place to start if you'd like to learn more about what I do and what's keeping me busy these days. Point your web browser there, and that's got links to all of the other websites and social media platforms and all that good stuff so that you can keep up with everything that I'm doing.
Which is a lot, as we said in the beginning.
I definitely do not find that I have very much free time on my hands, and I'm certainly not bored. So I'm keeping busy for sure.
Well, many thanks for being on the Photographing the West podcast, Tim. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Show notes for this program can be found at www.flanaganphotos.com. Until next time, good light and safe travels. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.